Hello and welcome to this sew along where you are going to learn how to sew your own strapless bra. My name's Jenny Rushmore and I run Cashmerette. We are a sewing pattern company dedicated to sew us with curves, and we make bra sewing patterns along with many other patterns, and our bras come in cup sizes from C to J, bands 28 to 54. Now, if you've ever tried to find a strapless bra in a store before and you have big boobs, well, I'm sure you already know it's practically an impossibility. First of all, they come in a really narrow range of sizes. So if you are anything bigger than a D cup, it can be just hard to even find one. But even if you can find a larger cup one, it is so common that they slip, that they are painful, that you don't actually get a nice shape in them. And it's such a shame because if you can't access a strapless bra, it really limits your wardrobe options. Forget about all these nice things that are off the shoulder, or even just styles where you could maybe wear a bra but not a heavy duty bra for big boobs. And it can be really depressing, especially in the summer or when you're trying to do evening wear or even something like bridal, if you don't have a strapless bra available to you. That is why my team and I spent a long time finally working out exactly how to make a sewing pattern for a strapless bra that provides amazing support and shape and is comfortable in sizes 28C to 54J. And that is the Symmes Strapless Bra, which you can see here now. So let's take a look at the features. So first up, we have the cups. Now these cups have been designed with multiple layers for the very best support that you can get. So we have an outer layer, and you can really use almost anything for this. It is a decorative layer, just any kind of pretty cotton. You could use like a lightweight knit, anything can really work. Then inside there is boning. So it is a 4-part cup, and along each seam there is boning. And that is one of the key things that gives you the really great shape and the support. On the inside, there is a foam layer, and then you have the option to put another lining layer in as well. It's really up to you. You don't have to, but that's an option. In addition, you can add boning along the top of the cup, which you can see here, which adds further shape and kind of rigidity and support along the top, but that's optional. Obviously, this is an underwire. And then in addition, in the band, we have some really clever boning. So there is boning in the center here, and this helps keep the gore against your body and to really get a nice fit here so that the bra doesn't tip out. If you have big boobs, you will know exactly what I mean by that. And then we have multiple pieces of boning at angles along the band. This helps avoid the boning digging into your body, which we know again is something that can really happen in strapless bras and is really not very comfortable. And it also just provides really fantastic support to keep the band flat all around your back. And then we have a tall hook and eye. So the height of this depends on the size that you're making, but this provides you with really firm support all the way around the back. When we first started working on a pattern like this, I didn't even know if it would be possible for big boobs, but I can tell you right now, it is. So with that, I'm gonna pass over to my teammate Jen, and she is gonna show you all about how you can sew your own.
Hi, I'm Jen Ryerson, and today I'm going to walk you through how to make the Symmes Strapless Bra. Okay, we're going to look at how to measure yourself and choosing your sizing. We're going to take a look at all the different fabrics that you need and what notions will be required. And then we're going to take a look at all the different pattern pieces that are involved, cutting them out, and we're going to go through step by step and sew this bra together. We're going to start by looking at our measurements and sizing. The first thing I want to say is that your ready-to-wear size will not necessarily correlate to your Cashmerette size. So you are going to want to start from the basics, take your measurements and choose your Cashmerette size. To find your sizing, you're going to need 2 measurements. You need your underbust measurement, which you're going to measure right here where your bra band sits. And then you're going to need your full bust measurement, which is measured at the fullest part of your body. It is important to wear your most supportive bra whilst you're taking your full bust measurements, because otherwise you may get an incorrect measurement. So once you have your measurements, we're going to use the size charts that are included in the Symmes instructions to actually calculate what size we're going to start with. I will say that if you have already made a Willowdale or a Loftus bra from Cashmerette, the sizing will be the same. So in that case, you can just use the same sizing. Now, if you do measure in between sizes, not all of us are nice round numbers, I would suggest for this pattern rounding up to the nearest size. It is easier to take things back in rather than trying to let things out. And the last point I wanted to make was just if you are outside our range, you can still make a bra that will fit with this pattern. The cups are what we call sister sized, so you'll be able to find a sister size cup pattern and then just adjust the band to fit. There is a lot more detail on how to do this, how to choose your sizing, and how to fit your bra in the link below. Okay, now let's talk about what fabrics that you need to make this bra. The outer fabric that you see on the outside of the bra is basically decorative. So you can use just about any fabric that you want for that. It is designed for a woven non-stretch fabric, but anything with up to about 10% stretch will actually work fine. If you go above 10%, you might find that it ends up bagging out because the foam underneath it isn't stretching. But yeah, up to 10% is fine. We've used many different things. The only limitations that we've found is really you do not want a fabric that frays when we're talking 1/4 inch seam allowances, and there is some stress on these seams. We had issues with it, seams coming out at times, so don't choose a fabric that's going to fray, and you want something that's relatively lightweight so it's not adding too much bulk. Okay, lining fabrics. There are 2 places on this bra that you can use lining. The first we discussed earlier is we can put a lining inside the cups. Now, the cups are finished fairly neatly without the lining, so it is just if you don't like the feel of the foam against your breast or something like that, then you can put a lining fabric in there. Again, the only real requirement is that it feels good against your skin. The other piece of lining is actually on the front band here. If you're using a cup lining, you just use the same fabric. If you're not using cup lining, you can basically choose any fabric, lining fabric for this. You can even just use a second layer of the main fabric. The most important part of your bra is probably the bra foam. Now, you do not want the molded cups. They're never going to be big enough for most of us who are sewing this. So what you need is the sheets of cut and sew foam. Now, generally it's called anywhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch thick, but both of these bras are 1/8 of an inch. They don't actually look it, but they are. And either one of these type of foams will work. The thicker the fabric, the more support it's going to give. The only other fabric that we need is just a small piece of mesh, power mesh for the back band. So now let's talk about some of the notions that we're going to need. The first thing we need is some elastic. Now we only need one type of elastic for this, which is very unusual for a bra, but all you need is 3/4 of an inch or about 19 to 20 millimeter wide plush back elastic. It can have the decorative trim or not, depending on what you can source. Now the only thing is 3/4 inch wide elastic is not always the easiest thing to source. If you can only find 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters, then you can use that, and I will talk in detail later about how to modify to accommodate that. The next thing we need is bias tape. Now, this is one time where I'm actually happy to use that pre-packaged bias tape. Normally it's a little bit too stiff for what you want in garment sewing, but for this it actually works really well. The single fold bias tape is not wide enough, so you will need double fold tape, and you're just going to unfold it and press it flat and trim it to 1 1/4 inches or about 3 centimeters wide. If you don't want to use the prepackaged tape, you can just cut 1 1/4 inch strips on the bias of your main fabric. Okay, the next one we need are the hook and eye. Depending on what size you're using, you could need anything from 3 to 9 hook and eyes. So the way to buy that, you can buy it as a continuous roll like I have here. You can buy them in like they often come in 7, 9, 13 hooks and eyes. You can always buy one of those and cut it down to the size you need. In fact, we found during sample making that you were probably better off buying a few more than you need and cutting it down to size. Generally, when you buy it like this, the edges aren't finished anyway, so buying larger and cutting it to size is probably your best bet to get the tape the exact size that you need. We're then going to need underwire channeling to put our underwires in. That's just your basic plush back underwire channeling. So the next thing we need are underwires. This pattern has been designed for use with the porcelain vertical underwires. You can learn a lot more about these, including how long they are and compare charts at the link below. Now, the last notion that we need is boning. There are numerous different types of boning out there. We went through and looked at all the different ones, and what we recommend is that you use the 1/4 inch wide plastic boning that comes already encased in its own casing. So as you can see, it's got the plastic boning inside, and then it's got this cotton casing along the outside. You can use the spiral steel boning, however, it doesn't come with the casing, so you'd have to make your own casing because we're assuming in this entire thing that it comes with the casing. Solid steel boning is not possible, it just doesn't go around the cups. And the Ridgeline sew-through boning is just not stiff enough for what we need. For more help with sourcing bra supplies, go to the link below. Now let's take a look at the different pattern pieces that are going to be required. Okay, the first 2 pattern pieces 1 and 2, are for the center front and the side front band. These are going to create the bridge to the bra. You're going to want to cut 2 of your main fabric. In this case, we're using a quilting cotton. And then you want 2 of your lining fabric. We're just using a nylon bra lining fabric today. Now, these pattern pieces do have notches. You can either mark them with a marker or take a tiny little snip. If you are going to snip, make sure it's very small because we only have 1/4 inch seam allowances. We also have boning lines marked on our pattern pieces, but we're going to get into those later once the band is put together, so you don't need to mark those quite yet. So that's pieces 1 and 2. Pattern piece 3 is our back band, and this one we're going to cut out of our power mesh fabric. Now this is technically our only stretch fabric, so we have a degree of stretch. So when you're looking at your fabric, you say, is it stretchier in that direction or that direction? And we want the stretchiest direction going across, so it's going around your body. Now, if you are using a fabric with some stretch for your lining and your bridge, I would put the stretch going along the grain line, so we want it going up and down rather than going across for that piece. Okay, now we've got pattern pieces 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are going to be used to create the cups. So again, we're going to want to cut 2 of our main fabric for each pattern piece, and we're going to want to mark or snip each of the notches. Now, if you want to put a lining on it, inside your bra cups, what you then need to do is trim your pattern pieces at the very top edge, take that 1/4 inch seam allowance off the top before cutting your lining fabric. So your lining fabric should be 1/4 inch smaller at the top than your main fabric. And again, you'll want to mark all of your notches for each of these pattern pieces. And then we have pattern pieces 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now these are for their bra foam. Technically, they are still the same pattern pieces as 4, 5, 6, and 7. However, we've removed a whole bunch of different seam allowances because what you can't do is sew foam together and create seam allowances. So what we end up doing is just butting the pieces up against each other and sewing them together like that. So we've removed all the seam allowances. So what that means is you do not want to snip any of your notches. Make sure that you mark them with a pen, a chalk marker. On this light coloured foam, I find a pencil just works the best. So you're going to cut 2 of each of these out of foam. Make sure you've marked all your little notch areas. Grain line on the foam, I found that most of the time it really doesn't matter about grain line so much. These are composite sort of fabric, so there is no specific grain line. But as a general rule, we're just going to keep the grain line going up and down along the bra cup. Okay, so we're very close to sewing. I just wanted to go and run through a few different things. We're sewing this on your basic sewing machine. All you need to have is a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. You can, if you wish, use a walking foot, but personally I find it's easier with the small pattern pieces to just use the standard foot. We're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and unless otherwise specified, we'll just be sewing with a straight stitch, your basic 2.5 to 3, and then when the zigzag stitches are required, we will specify that in the instructions, and I'll show you in the sew along. Okay, let's get started. Okay, we are going to start our sewing with the front band, with the main fabric. So as you can see here, I've laid it all out. We've got our center front band, 2 pieces, and our side front band. We are going to start by putting the center front and side front bands right side together, aligning the edges. We just need a couple of pins to hold this in place. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side as well. Once we have it pinned in place, I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and we will sew our seams. Okay, as I said earlier, we are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so make sure you know where on your foot the 1/4 inch is. In my case, we're just lining it up with this line on the foot here. And we want to make sure we backstitch at each end. And our second piece. Okay, once we've sewn our seams, we're going to press the seam allowances open. Okay, repeat with your second front band. Okay, once you've got these pieces together, we're going to sew the center front seam. So once again, we want right sides together, and we're just going to pin at top and bottom to hold everything in place. And then we're going to take this to the machine and again sew it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Once again, you want to make sure you backstitch. Okay, once again, we're going to press our seam allowances open, if we can get them open. Okay. I'm just going to make sure that that one is also press open still. So we now have the front band complete. So you're going to go back and do that with the same pieces, the side front and the center front pieces of the lining, to create a lining that is the same. The next step is attaching the back band, piece 3, to our assembled front band. Now, the issue with this piece is it's almost square, so you have to be really careful. You can see I've kept the pattern piece with the fabric until this point. And then we make sure that we know which way is up the top and where our notches are on this side. And then we can place it on top. So you want right side of the power mesh facing the right side of the band. And then we're just going to again pin with our edges aligned. And we'll take this to the sewing machine again. Okay, now this time, instead of sewing at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, we're just going to baste this on at an 1/8 of an inch because we need to sew that seam fully later. I'm not going to worry about changing the stitch length. I'm just going to sew at that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. The basting stitches will stay in the final garment. And for basting stitches, I don't bother back stitching at the start of the beginning. Okay, and the second side, again at 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we've basted on our back bands. So now we are going to attach our lining. We do not want to open up these seam allowances. We want to keep them folded like this. And then we're going to take our lining and with the right side of the lining facing the right side of the band, we're just going to place it over the top so the back band is sandwiched in between. So we're going to line up the edges once again. Just put a couple of pins in. And make sure our notches are all aligned so everything is up around the right way. And then on the second side as well. Okay, now we want to line up this very center gore section as well. Make sure that your seam allowances are pressed flat and you want to make sure that seam is aligned. And as you can see here, there's just a few millimeters out. That's just the way it was cut. We can always trim that down later. So we're just going to leave that as it is. And we're going to take that to our machine. Okay, now we're going to sew through the lining, the back band and the main fabric. And we're going to go back to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance now. And again, back stitching at the beginning and the end. And on the second side as well. Now, before we go any further, we are also going to sew across this top of the bridge section, also at a 1/4 of an inch. And making sure I don't sew over my pins. And then last but not least, we're actually going to fold back the lining and we're going to understitch the lining to the seam allowance underneath. So we want the stitching to be 1/8 of an inch from the seam line on the lining side. Okay, now before I get too many threads, we're going to go through, trim all our threads and turn it inside right. Back at the table. Okay, so now that we've sewn both side seams, we've sewn across the top of the bridge and then we've understitched right there. Now we can try and turn it inside, right sides out. So we basically just need to do some magic, and it never works first time. It's one of those things where I always have to play with it, but woohoo, look at that, we managed to get there. Okay, so at this point you can give those seams a little bit of a press, but I'm actually just going to go ahead and pin for my basting first. So looking at this from the lining side, we just want to make sure that all of our layers are staying together. So we're going to end up basting around each cup and then along the bottom here. So I find that the best thing to do is to start by lining up these seams. Having the see-through bra lining actually makes it nice and easy. You can see, make sure that the seam allowances are open, nested on top of each other. And then we can do the same in this center section. Just work our way down from the top, making sure that that seam allowance is open. Oh. Now, at that top edge, it folds just a little bit so that you can't see the lining from the correct side. So you might find that it goes off just a little bit at the bottom there, but we'll just pin that in place. And then we're just going to go back, put in a few more pins just to hold this in place, and then we'll do some basting. Okay, so I've pinned the layers together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start right up on one corner. We don't want to sew on the back band fabric because we're using a straight basting stitch and that needs the stretch. So we're just going to start right at that seam line, baste across the top and around the cup. Then we're going to start again and baste around this cup and again over to the seam line. And then finally, right along the bottom edge from one seam to the other. Okay, now that we've got all layers basted together along both the cups and the bottom edge, it's time to apply the elastic. We're going to put elastic along the bottom edge and then we're going to put it along each of these top edges. Now, in the instructions, we do have a chart that shows you how long to cut the elastic if you're a bit unsure. I remember the first time I made a bra, they didn't tell us how long the elastic was and I was like, I don't know, so I do try and include that in our instructions. But yes, so basically we are going to attach the elastic so that the plush side of the elastic is facing up because it will eventually flip over and face our body. But for the time being, we want the plush side of the elastic facing up and we want the edge of the elastic without the decorative edge aligned with the edge of the fabric. Now this is where if you have elastic that is not 3/4 of an inch, you actually need to do a separate step beforehand. So if your elastic is not 3/4 of an inch, you're going to want to go on and using a marker, mark in the lines. Let me just grab it. We have our stitching lines shown on the pattern pieces. So you're going to want to mark those onto your fabric and then you're going to want to place the fabric, place the elastic so that the stitching line where you're going to stitch lines up with that line marked on your fabric. But if you are using 3/4 of an inch elastic, you don't need to do that. You can just align the edges. First of all, if you do want to use a pre-cut length of elastic, I would suggest finding the center and putting a pin in place and then pinning at either end. Before stitching. However, if you are more comfortable and don't want to pre-cut your elastic, you can just use a length of elastic and cut it when you get to the end. Okay, now first of all we have to set up our machine because on this we're going to need a zigzag stitch. So you want your zigzag to be 2.5 wide by about 3 long. If your machine does not have those exact numbers, you just choose as closest you can. And you want a zigzag stitch. And we're going to be having the center of the zigzag stitch run just down the edge of the elastic here, whilst the elastic is sitting right against the edge of the fabric. Now we do not need to stretch the elastic as we sew. It is 1-to-1, so there's no stretching required. So we'll just start sewing. Oh, no, I have not accounted for the fact that this is a zigzag and I need to move over just a smidge. There we go. So I just keep trying to line it up. So at the center here, I'm just going to put my needle down and lift the presser foot. And here I am just going to apply just a smidgen of tension just to get around that curve. And then we go back to no tension. So since I was sewing with my long length of elastic, I didn't cut it to length. I will now just trim the elastic back along the edge of the center back. If you used the pre-cut length, it should have just ended evenly on either end. Now, as you can see here, I've used a contrast stitching, which really shows up on the, so black on white. You can definitely use a thread color that matches your fabric. This is all just shown for sew-along purposes. So we now have the lower elastic attached. We're going to do exactly the same thing on the upper edges. So again, you're going to want the plush face of the elastic facing up and the picot edge, if there is one, facing towards the main part of the bra. You're going to line up that edge, or if your elastic is a little narrower, you'll line up the stitching line with your marked stitching line. And then you're just going to sew with the same zigzag stitch at the same location right along that picot edge on both the right and the left-hand sides. Okay, now we've sewn on our lower and our upper elastic bands. We're going to flip the whole thing over and we're just going to trim away all the extra seam allowance from behind both of these pieces of elastic. So if you have a pair of the duckbill scissors, these work really well. Okay, so I've now trimmed the seam allowances back from behind the elastic. Now, we are not going to flip the elastic and stitch it down. That will come later. But right now, we need to mark the boning channels. So if we go back to our pattern pieces, you'll see that there are boning markings on all three of these pieces. So we're going to mark these lines on the wrong side of our band. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can do this. Often, I will just fold down the edge. You can then align that. Just mark the two, that end, and then we'll do the same on the bottom. Marking here, marking here, and marking right there. And then we can just use a ruler to join our markings. We only need to mark between the stitching lines because that's where our boning is going to go. Now, another option for marking, if you don't like doing it that way, is to use some of these wax paper and a tracing wheel. So basically you just put the wax paper side down. We're going to align our pattern piece over the top. Remember that that stitching line should be lined up with the actual seam line. And then we can just use the tracing wheel to mark our stitching lines. Okay, that was very faint, so I will actually go over that again, but it gives you the markings that you need. And then for this one, it's actually going all the way. So we want to start up on this back piece and come all the way down. Now, as you can see, we have 4 pieces of boning on the side here. Depending on what size you're using, that could be up to 6. So just follow your pattern pieces and mark your boning accordingly. And then in the center here, again, I'm going to fold my pattern piece so I can see my center line. I'm going to mark. The top is aligned with the stitching line again. And we'll just mark that center point there. And then, let's see. Yeah, I'm just going to fold the seam allowance back again. Mark the other end of our stitching line. Now, because we're doing this for 2 sides, we need to do that again on the other side. Find our marking. And then we're just going to join those points up. So, now, there is one more set of boning that will go in right up this center line, but it's already marked, so we don't need to mark that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do that on the other side as well, and then we're going to start attaching our boning. Okay, so as you can see, I've gone ahead and marked everything with a Sharpie just so that you can actually see it more clearly here. Our next step is to start applying the boning. So, when you buy the boning, it comes with the plastic already encased in the cotton casing. There are 2 different ways that you can go about applying this at this point in time. So one is you can just leave it as it is, and you can keep the boning in the casing, and then you're going to cut each piece to length, and the boning will be cut at that same time. The problem with that is that you do then have to cut the boning a second time later. So cutting this boning, whilst it's possible, it does need a lot of grip strength. So having to do it twice is not always the easiest thing. So what I generally do is I will just take this entire roll and I will just remove the casing from the boning. So I'm left with all of the boning and then just a long length of casing. And in that case, we can just apply the casing to the right length, and then we can just cut the boning once to fit. I'm going to show you on this how to do it both ways, just so you can see. So the first thing we need to do is to measure each of these lengths. Now, in the instructions, there is a table where you can write down all of these lengths. However, I'm just going to show you a really simple way, is all I ever do. You can place the casing over, you want the line to go right down the center of the casing. And then we're just going to take our Sharpie and we're just going to mark just inside that stitching line. Now, I'm going to make sure that it's the right angle at the bottom here. And then we can just cut that casing to length. Let me just grab my pins. So I'm then going to pin this in place. Now, I will want to make sure that I'm pinning from the bottom and the heads are towards the top of the bra. Otherwise, you're going to have problems taking the pins out as we go along. I also know that one of our other sewing people have used Wonder Tape to stick it in place so that you don't need to use pins. So that's how you do it if you have your boning and your casing separately. Now, or the other option is to take our ruler can measure the length of the line. So in this case, we're looking at about 4 1/4 inches. And then we can measure the same 4 1/4 here. I'm just going to make it mark so that we can see that nice and easily. Now, because the boning is still inside this casing, do not use your sewing scissors. You will want to find just an old pair of normal scissors for this. And then I do find it's easier if you bend the boning and you can cut through it. But it does take a lot of strength if you do not have a lot of grip strength. Co-opting somebody to come in and help you with this section is definitely the way to go. So we'll then have this piece of boning in place. And once again, it makes it much harder to pin in place. This is where you might want to use Wonder Tape. You can take the boning out of the channel at this point, but you're going to need to mark it if that's the case so that we know exactly where it goes back in later. So let's just do that. We'll assume that this is coming out. We'll just take like a little piece of tape, wrap it around it, use our Sharpie. We'll just number 1. This is number 2 on the left-hand side. And then I'm just going to keep that somewhere nearby. And then again, we can pin the casing. Okay, at this point, I would normally go through and pin all of it together, but I will show you how to sew these first, and then we'll move on to the next step, and I'll do that later. Okay, so we're ready to sew our boning in. So what we want to do is leave the lower edge of the casing open. So I'm actually going to start sewing right down here at the bottom. Now you may not be able to see, but there's actually a line of stitching on the casing, and we want to sew right on top of that line. So we do need some slight precision sewing here. We're going to start down this bottom end, back stitch, and then we're just going to sew up the edge. And then as we get to the top, we do not want to sew onto the elastic. We're going to stop just before, and then we're going to pivot and sew along the top. I may have gone just a step too far there, but we'll just sew along the top. And then we're going to sew back and forwards again. I'm actually just going to use my hand wheel to finish that. Turn again. And then we're going to stitch down the opposite side. Again, we want to make sure we're sewing right on top of that line of existing line of stitching so that we can still fit the boning into the casing. So if you have your boning inside your casing, you can technically sew it with the boning in there. However, you have to make sure that you don't sew over the top of the boning or you won't be able to get it in and out. And it, because it's not a totally flat surface, it can be a little more difficult. So I am just going to take the boning out, make sure we have our marking on it so we know where it goes back in. Put that aside. And then I'll just pin this back in place. And we will sew the boning in without the channeling in, without the boning. At the top, just to secure it, and then back down this way. Okay, so I have gone ahead and I've sewn the boning in. So before you go any further, you want to double check that the boning will in fact fit into each of the casings. So you can just take, it doesn't, like the boning is the same size, so you can just take any piece of boning and just slowly try and, does it fit in? Yes, it does on this one, but I can already see here that I can see my stitches have come inside, so I have a feeling that it's not, yeah, up here, it's not going to fit through. So in this case, I am going to have to take that stitching out and redo it. Now, one thing to make sure that you understand, this stitching is going to be visible from the right hand side. So in your bobbin, you will want a thread that matches your fabric. You won't be able to see the lines. I've just drawn those on in Sharpie, but you will see the stitching lines from that side, and you will want to probably not make a feature of it. We're going to continue with all of those in just a second, but I want to show you the center section here is just a little bit different. So we'll show you how to do that. So again, we're going to take our piece of casing and lay it along our line. We want to get the edge of this to be parallel to our stitching line for the elastic. So we'll trim that off, and then we're going to come all the way up here, and then on this one it needs to be parallel to the center front line. So as you can see, that is quite a large angle. So we are going to cut our casing along these two angles. I am going to need my fabric scissors for this because it doesn't have the boning in there. Okay, and then I want a second piece for this side. So now we have two pieces of channeling that are going to sit together really neatly just along that stitching line. I'm just going to pin that in place. And this again could be a good use for wonder tape. We're just going to do it with pinning today. And then pin down the bottom. Now, as I mentioned before, all of this stitching can be seen on the right hand side, and this is right in the center of your bra. So what we want to do, just to make it look a little neater, is instead of sewing up and back on each piece of stitching, we're going to sew up one side and then back down the other. And then we're going to sew up the inside and back down the other. Make sure we get a nice little peak right on that center seam there. Okay, I'm just going to do that piece of sewing. Okay, so we're going to start sewing down at the bottom of the band again. On one side, back stitch. So right along your stitching line. All the way up. And I'm actually just going to try and use my hand wheel to get it just right in that center seam before I pivot. And come back down the other side. So we're then going to do the same thing in the same direction, but on the inside. Again, I want to get this turn right on that center line, so I'll just use my hand wheel to finesse. Not my best piece of sewing in terms of keeping it on the stitching, but what does it look like from the front? That's what I'm really worried about, and it's not too bad. We're off by a millimeter, but I think I will live with that. I will need to unpick a stitch just down here. We've gone right onto the elastic accidentally, but that's looking pretty good. Okay, we've sewn on our two angled pieces. So our last piece of boning channeling is just going to run right up the center front here. So we want the channeling to start at about the understitching line, and then we'll bring it down to the lower edge. See if I can get my pen open. We'll just mark that length. Now, this is actually one of probably the trickiest parts of sewing, because we're going to see these lines and we're going to get them evenly around this center seam. Otherwise it can look a little strange. Normally I would try sewing this from the right side, but to try and sew it from the right side and only get on the very edge of this, I've struggled with that numerous times. I found that the best thing to do is to just take your pins and try pinning right in the center of the channeling, and then double check. Yeah, that's on the seam line, not quite. So let's move it just a little bit. Okay, we'll move down a step. So I use a lot more pins from here than I would normally. I'm right on that center line, and that's in the center of my channeling. Now this is going right over the top of those last two pieces that we sewed on. Now that looks centered there, but it does not look centered there. So we're just going to try that again. Okay, we're getting pretty close here. One more. Now remember, we need the pins facing upwards, because once again we're going to start sewing down the bottom. Okay, that looks pretty good. So let's sew on our last piece of channeling here. Once again, start down the bottom, across the top, and then back down this side. I'm just taking it really slowly so I can try and sew right on the edge. And now the moment of truth. How did it work? Well, it's not perfect, but for what we've got, I think that that's going to work. So at this point, we're going to go back, we're going to add boning to all of these other locations, and then we're going to do our test to make sure that our boning fits into each of the channels. We're not worrying about length yet, and we're not worrying about... So just keep, if you have cut your pieces to length, just make sure that they're still labeled and you've got them put off to the side somewhere. Okay, we have now sewn on all of our boning channels. So this is actually a slightly different size to the one we were working on earlier. As you can see, there's now 5 pieces of boning. You don't need to add extra at this point. This is just a different size. Your pattern piece will tell you exactly how many pieces of channeling that you need for your size. Okay, we do not have our boning inside the channels yet. If you've already cut them, they can still be sitting aside. And if you haven't cut them yet, we will cut them in a short while. But we're now ready to move on to the next step, which is finishing the elastic. We are only going to finish the top edges of the elastic at this point. We're going to leave the bottom open so that we can put the boning in at a later stage. So for right now, we are just going to fold our elastic to the wrong side. It's going to fold right along that line of stitching. And then we're going to stitch from the right side of the fabric, but along the edge of this fabric. So if it's easier for you, you can add some pins in to show you exactly where you're going to be stitching. And then the other thing we have to think about is that we do not want to sew across the boning channeling, because if we sew all the way across the boning channeling at this point, we won't be able to put our boning in and have it go all the way to the top of the band. So we're going to have to sew, stop and start at the edge of each piece of channeling. So we're going to sew in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stages, which can get a bit annoying, but okay, so I'm just going to roughly pin that in place. and then we'll take that to the machine. Okay, so we are now going to sew, once again, because we're sewing on elastic, we want to change to a zigzag stitch. So you want it to be 2.5 wide by 3 long. So all of those stitch lengths are in the instructions. Now again, we're sewing close to the edge of the elastic, so I'm just going to line up my foot so that I know where that is, and we can just start. Make sure your machine is on zigzag. Now, we're just going to sew just until the edge of the channeling here. Then we're going to backstitch. Whoa, and I took a stitch too far, but I can undo that later. So then we're going to move on, move across to the other side of the channeling. Start sewing it again with the zigzag stitch. And just keep going, stopping and starting at each of those channeling pieces. I feel like I'm getting off the elastic here, so I'm just moving it back underneath. I can feel where it is with my fingers. Okay, last little section. Okay. So we just trim off all of the threads in between and repeat for the other side top edge of the band. Okay, I've finished off both of the upper pieces of elastic. We are not finishing the lower elastic at this point, and we're also not putting our boning in at this point, because when we go to put the cups in, it's much easier to do without the boning in. So test that a piece of boning will slide into each of your channels at this point, but we don't want to put the boning in quite yet. So at the moment we are finished with the bands, and we will move on to making the cups. Okay, so with the cups, I find that the best thing to do is to lay out all your pieces. So you've got like a right cup and a left cup, and then the right foam and the left foam, and the right lining and the left lining, because I found that every time that I haven't done this, I've ended up with 2 left lining pieces, and and it just won't go together anymore, and I'm sitting there and unpicking everything. So I do find that it's really helpful to lay everything out, and then you're just going to work with like one section at a time. So you know that these ones are always going to go together. These ones are going to go together. So yeah, we're going to now put all of these to the side and just work with one main cup. Okay, so we have here all the pieces that we need for one main cup. We've got the side cup, the outer middle cup, the inner middle cup, and the center cup. So what we're going to do is we're just going to sew all of these together, matching notches, right sides together. We'll start at the outside and work our way in. So just lining it up at the notches to start with. Need some pins, and then at either end. Now, at the ends, you can remember to line it up at the seam line. So the cut edges may not necessarily line up, but we just want to make sure it's going to line up at that seam line 1/4 inch down. Okay, so we're just going to sew at 1/4 inch with a straight stitch, again around 2.5 to 3 long, and at 1/4 inch. Back stitching at each end. Okay, so we've sewn our first seam. Now you can press it at this stage, but because our next couple of seams are not intersecting, I'm just going to go ahead and sew all of my cup seams, and then we'll go back and finish and press them all. So now I'm going to sew the outer middle cup to the inner middle cup. Again, right sides together, matching notches. Okay, and whilst we're here, let's go ahead and pin on our next center cup as well. And then we can sew them all at once. Once again, right sides together, matching our notches. Just sewing a straight stitch, 1/4 inch. And now our final cup seam to sew the center cup on. With the seam allowances, we've chosen a fabric that doesn't fray, so we don't have to finish it, and all of these seam allowance will be totally enclosed in the bra, so we do not need to do any seam finishing. If you're finding that the fabric is a little bulky, you can grade the seams down, cut one or both sides down to 1/8 inch. I'm just going to leave it as it is, and we're just going to press each of these seams. So, starting at the side cup, we're going to press the side cup towards the outer middle cup. You are going to need some sort of tailor's ham, rolled up towel to do this, because they are very curved seams. In fact, can I find the right place to press on this ham? There we go. Okay, and then from the outer middle cup to the inner middle cup, we're going to press it, well, this one can realistically go either way, but I'm going to press it towards the inner cup. Now, this fabric is quilting cotton, so I'm just using my iron straight on it. If you are using a bra fabric, a duoplex or something like that, you will want to use a pressing cloth. We don't need to burn any holes in our bra. I've done that a couple of times so far. Okay, and then on the center cup, that it definitely presses better towards the inner middle cup. So you can press it from the outside, and then you can press them from the inside, just to give us a really nice, clean, sharp line along those seams. So I've done the outside, now let's just give them a quick press from the inside. Okay, and the first step on the cups is complete. So what you're going to do now is exactly the same thing with the second set of main pieces to make our main cup, other main cup, and then you're going to do the exact same thing again with the lining. Now, the only thing with the lining is you want to make sure that the seams are going to end up facing inside the cup. Okay, so we have our lining pieces here for the same cup. So what you want to make sure you're doing is, instead of like what we have here, because it's very hard to see because this doesn't have a right and a wrong side, but technically the right side is now the underside. So you're going to put those right sides together, pin in place, and sew. So that when we're all done, the seams are going to be facing towards the inside of the cup. Okay, so we have now sewn both of our main cups and both of our lining cups. So at this point, you just want to double check that you have two symmetrical cups. They're not exactly the same, and that you've got two linings that match inside. You want to make sure that the linings have the seams pointing to the inside of the bra. Let's just check this one. Yep. Okay, so now that we have our main cups done, we're going to work on our foam cups. So let's just switch these over again and push them off to the side and bring out our cup pieces. So, as I said before, these only have a few seam allowances, mainly around the underwire edge that are left on them. So we're going to be sewing them butted up against each other. So we'll just start sewing like that, and we're just going to roll it. We can match up our notches as we go, and then just make sure our ends match. And we're going to do that for all three of our seams. So we don't do any pinning on the foam or anything. We're going to take this straight over to the sewing machine, and then I'll talk about stitch lengths. Okay, we want to set our machine back up to a zigzag stitch. Now, what we want is a width of around 6, or if your machine doesn't go to 6, as high as it will go, and a length of around 1.5. So a short length, really wide, fairly short. And then we're just going to get started. We want to make sure that we've got the center point of our zigzag right along the center where the two pieces are joining. And we're just going to get started. Matching up our markings. Okay, that's the first seam done, and you can already see the shape starting to take shape. So we'll move on and sew our inner middle cup to our outer middle cup. So as you go, if you notice one feeling slightly shorter or longer than the other, you can just sort of smoosh it back into shape. And then we're going to add this center cup as well. Again, I want to try and get those markings lined up. Okay, now I noticed when I was going that I've gone a little off here, so we've got a bit of a hole. So I'm just going to go back over that. So I'm going to look back and see where I've started to go off track, which is at about this point. And then I'm just going to go back over that again. Okay, so it really doesn't matter if we go back over it a second time. On the inside, it's going to be covered with the stitching is going to be covered with the boning. And then on the other side, it's covered with the main fabric, so you'll never actually see this. Okay, so we have our foam cup sewn now, and you can see that it's taking shape, but this foam is really not that thick, so it's not holding its shape too well. So at this point, we're going to add our boning. Now, I would actually also sew the second foam cup before you go ahead, so you're not changing stitches on your machines. So go ahead and sew that second foam cup now, and then you can come back to the boning. The first thing I want to do is to figure out what is the right and the wrong side of this. So we're going to take one of our cups And we're just going to decide, okay, this is the outside, so it needs to go like this to sit inside of our cup. So we then want the boning on the inside of the cup, so it's going to be on this back edge here. So I'm just going to take a marker and mark along these seam lines, just so that I remember that this is the one, that this is the side that I'm seaming, boning. Okay, now we just need our channeling back. Now for this one, it is definitely easier to take the boning out of the channeling, trying to, before you cut it. It allows you to measure it much more easily. So I'm just going to, once again, lay the boning on. Now I want it to hang over slightly at the end so I can trim this away later. I'll pin that in place there and then slowly walk it along that seam, pinning again in place on the other end. And then we'll just mark along this top edge and cut that boning piece to length. Now I will cut this just a little bit shy of my marking because we want it to sit just underneath the top. It doesn't need to come right to the very edge. And then I'm just going to continue doing that along each of the seam lines. So we start at one end, work our way up, pinning as we go. And then marking and trimming. Okay, so we've got boning along each of the 3 seam lines now. This next piece of boning is basically optional. As your cup sizes get larger, the gaps between the boning obviously also increases. So it's really a matter of personal choice here, but just take a look. And if you're at any stage, this is probably the maximum width between boning that I'd allow. But as the cup size go up, I would start adding in extra strips of boning. So for my size, I found that it's definitely nice to have an extra piece of boning on this outer cup. So I am going to add an extra piece of boning in just about halfway through this cut piece. As I said, if your cut piece is larger, you may want to add in pieces right down the middle here and down the middle here. It's really up to you how much support you feel that you need. Okay, I've got all my channeling in place. We're now going to go sew this. Okay, now remember to switch your machine back to a straight stitch, standard length again, and we're just going to start sewing. We want to make sure that our zigzag stitching is covered as we go along. And then at the top we pivot, sew along the top, and then back down the other side. Okay, and then we're just going to do the same thing for each of the other boning channels. Okay, we now have all of our boning channels applied to our foam bra cup. As you can see, it's starting to hold its shape really well now. So the next step is the optional lining. So if you're not applying a lining, we can skip to the next section. But if you are applying a lining, we will just take let's take our main cup, move it out of the way, and then this obviously, We've got to make sure that this is where everything gets a little bit confused, and you've got to make sure you've got the right ones. So we have the right side of the lining facing your body. So the wrong side of the fabric is facing the boning channels. Okay, and all we're going to do is we're going to match up our seams and our corners, and they should match nicely. Make sure your seams are all pressed to one side still. And now, what we are not going to do is sew along this lower edge because we still need to be able to get our boning in and out. So we're going to start sewing just here. We're going to sew up, across the top, down here, along this side, and we're going to stop sewing right here. Okay, we are going to just baste this on. So we're just going to sew it about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. You can increase your stitch length a little bit, and we'll just start sewing at this first piece of channeling. We go up and across the top, making sure our edges align. Pivot again at this section. And then we're going to stop sewing right here at the next piece of channeling we come to. And we're going to leave the lining open along this bottom edge. Okay, now that we've attached our lining to our foam cups, if you are not using a lining, you're going to pick back up again here. We're going to set this aside for just a second, and we're going to work on attaching our main shell to the foam cup. But the first thing we need to do is add a bias tape along the top of the main cup. So as I said earlier, you can use the prepackaged bias tape, or you can cut your own, but it needs to be 1¼ inches wide. Now, the double fold bias tape that I have is wider than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roughly measure out, adding a little bit, you know, we want at least 2 inches, 1½ to 2 inches on each side. And then I'm just going to cut that length. And then we're just going to press this flat. Now that we've got it flat, I'm just going to cut it down to 1¼ inches wide. I'm going to use the rotary cutter because that makes it a lot easier to just measure it and cut it really neatly. Measuring that. Oh, this rotary cutter is not working so well. Okay, so we now have that bias strip that is 1¼ inches wide. What we're going to do is, it's not really right side of this, but if there was a right side, you want right side facing. Make sure you've got at least 1½ inches hanging off the edge. So past the edge of the cup itself. And then we're going to pin and sew this at 1/4 inch. So it's just going to go right across the top of the cup. Once again, make sure that at this other side you have at least 1½ inches. It's coming right off the edge of the cup there, because we will need to use that in a minute or two. Okay, so we're going to go and we're going to sew this at 1/4 inch from the edge. Okay, with that seam, we want to make sure that the seam allowance is pressed towards the bias tape and the bias tape is away from the cup. Now at these ends, I like to just continue the 1/4 of an inch turn up. And then we'll go back to this first edge and make sure it's turned up at that 1/4 of an inch as well. Just make sure that that's a nice, neat from the front side. Okay, the next step is to fold the bias tape basically in half so that your raw edge is just sitting at the seam line there. And we're going to go all the way around. Just going to check that that is all pressed. Okay, and then one more time, we're going to fold it at that seam line now. So you want to have just a little bit of the main fabric visible from this wrong side. We're going to press that one more time. Okay, so if we look at it from the right side, we now have a nice clean edge along the top here. With none of the bias tape visible. Make sure that that's all folded neatly, just how it's going to be on the final product. And we're just going to trim the bias tape along the edge of the cup. So what happens is when that opens it out, it gives us that truing of that seam and it'll make that the next seam that we sew much easier. So we're going to do that on the other side as well. We're just going to fold it how it's meant to be. Keep it nicely aligned with the cup and just trim it right along the edge of the cup there. Okay, so now we can open that back out again. I wouldn't press it because we want that seam line, and we're ready to attach our main fabric to our foam and lining. Okay, so now we've got our lining, our main cup, shell, and our foam, and we're going to put it all together. Now, let me just... So what we can do now is this new angle that we've cut here will line up just nicely with that seam, and we're just going to pin, or I should say, we want the right side of the fabric facing the lining or the boning at this point. And yeah, we're going to line it up along this top edge. I'm actually going to pin along the edge because we want to sew right to that point. Now, it looks like the cup is not going to line up at this point, but it does. It's magic. I then go to the other end, make sure that's all lined up nicely. Pin it there, and then we'll just add a few more pins in place just to make sure. Okay. So we're ready to sew this. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to sew right along that fold line. So it's now a 1/2 inch seam allowance basically. So what we are going to do is sew this bias tape to the foam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which will put us right in the fold. However, this is where we need to make a decision on whether or not you want to put boning along this top edge. Because if you want to put boning along this top edge, you will sew this seam slightly differently to if you do not. So basically, if we do not want to put boning along the top edge, you want the boning in each of these channels to be able to come all the way up to the very top. So our seam is going to come through slightly further south. So we're going to stop sewing and start sewing again at each of those channels. Whereas if you do want boning along the top, you can just sew all the way along. So I'm going to show you how to do it if you are going to put the boning in all the way to the top and not have the boning along the channel. We're going to sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then when we get to the boning, we're going to stop and move along to the other side of the boning. Starting again, making sure I'm still at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't want to stitch too far there, I'll take that stitch out later. Okay, our last little section. Ooh, that didn't sound good. Now that that seam is sewn, what we're going to do is we're going to flip our shell over, and we're going to basically understitch the seam allowance between the bias and the shell to the edge of the foam. So we're going to be sewing right along the edge of the foam. Let's switch this over so we can actually see the foam again. We want the seam allowance to be tucked down behind the foam, and we're just going to sew right on the very edge of the foam. So I'm just tugging the mane and the foam apart so that we've got a nice seam. But we want to make sure that that seam allowance stays tucked under. Okay, so now as you can see, we have the inside of the lining nicely finished with the bias tape, and then we have a second row of stitching with the understitching. Now, as you can see, we've gone off the bias tape here, but that's okay, as long as you are actually on the foam. So that is the only requirement for this line of stitching. You want to be on the foam here. Okay, so let's just quickly double check. Look, when we fold it down to the right side, that is all lining up neatly. Okay, but at this point, you need to make that final decision on whether or not you're going to put boning along the top. So basically we have just created another channel here into which you can put boning. Now, whether you've stopped and started stitching here, either way, you can still put boning in at this point in time. So let's show you how to do that. Basically, I'm just going to take the boning out of the channel. We don't need it within a channel at this point. The boning comes already curved, so we want to make sure that that curve is sitting along our body. So we'll just put the cup together and make sure we know which way it's sitting. We want the curve to go this way, and then we're going to insert the boning into this channel. Okay, now I've just done it so that it comes out at the other end at this point. We're going to pull it back, and we want the boning to start about 1/2 inch from the end there. So at the moment I can feel the boning in the channel sitting here, and it's about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to mark on the boning where we are, and then I'm going to pull it back out and mark again 1/2 inch so that it's going to sit inside the channel. Okay, so we're going to just cut at this inner line. Now, we need to figure out how to finish the ends of our plastic boning. At the moment, that is really sharp and spiky. You do not want to have that inside your bra. There are a number of different ways. You can try using a metal nail file and filing it down. If you've got a little Dremel tool, you can use that to round the ends. What I've found works fairly easily is if I just chop off the corners and then take a lighter or any sort of flame, you can just have a candle burning and hold it over the top of the flame, and you're just going to run it gently over the top of end of the thing, and it just very slightly melts the plastic. You then have to wait for a few seconds for it to melt, but what we have now is a nice plastic rounded edge on that. So that's, yep, I can touch that now, and it's nice and rounded, not going to jab into me at all. So we finished this end. Let's push it back out the other end and do the same thing there. So again, I'm just going to cut a tiny little corner off to make it slightly rounded. And then I'm just going to use the lighter, just briefly. We don't want to hold it under the lighter too much because it will entirely melt and you end up with a really big glob of plastic at the end, which then doesn't go back into the channel. But yep, that's all nice now. Okay, so let's push that back inside the channel. Make sure we've got at least a ½ an inch on either side. Yep, I can feel that there. Okay, so we are now ready to pull our main fabric all the way down over our cup. So it's probably going to need a really good tug at this point. You're going to line up your seams and give it a bit of a pin. And we're just going to go through and pin all around. So needs to be pulled out slightly there. So this is where it actually helps if you do have that little bit of a stretch in your fabric and you've got it going up and down. That's just going to allow you to more easily get that, but it does work with your okay. So what we need to do now is we need to baste the ends. We need to go over these very ends of these channels, backstitch there, but we only want to sew down to where the these channeling starts, because we still need to put the boning into all of these channeling. So we can just baste it together along this edge, and then again along that edge and down to the first piece of channeling there. Okay, so I have done that basting now. You can see because we already had the lining in there, the basting is just over the existing basting stitches. And now we are ready to put our boning into our channels. So once again, the first thing we need to do is finish this end of the boning, which is going to end up at the top. So we want to cut off our corners. This one was already cut off a little bit, so that's okay. Use our lighter to melt it a little bit, just a little bit. And once again, we've got to look at the curvature of the boning, make sure it's going to match the curvature of the cup, and then we will just insert. Yeah, got to find those 2 layers of the casing. Now, generally, if you were planning on putting the boning in, the boning would only go to this point here. It won't go past the bias tape. But because I have allowed that boning to not be in there, I could actually push the boning all the way up. However, we certainly don't want that. So I'm going to pull it back out a little bit, make sure it's just sitting right there at the edge of the bias tape. And then once again, I'm going to make a mark on our tape, and then we're going to pull it back out, and we're going to cut it approximately ½ an inch shorter, 3/8 of an inch to ½ of an inch shorter than that mark, and then trim off the corners, make it slightly rounded, and give it a bit of a melt. And we're just going to do exactly the same thing for each of these channels. Okay, I have gone and inserted boning into each of the boning channels now. We've made sure that all of the ends are nicely finished. And what we want to do now is we want to pull the lining and the main fabric back out of the way. So we've just got the foam, and we're going to stitch probably as close to the end of the boning as you can. I found that having the boning not be able to move too much is better, so I'm going to stitch as close to the end of each piece of boning as I can, and we're just stitching through the foam and the channeling. So we've got the main fabric and the lining fabric pulled back out of the way. Okay, and we'll just do that for every single channel. And last one is right up here. Make sure that's pushed back as far as it can go. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to pull our lining down. Make sure that that is in place. We're going to flip it over and make sure our main fabric is pulled down and in place. And then we're going to baste through all layers, just from that edge of the basting to that edge. Oh, good thing I double checked the back. Okay, let's finish this cup. Okay, so we've now basted in place. It's meant to be about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I got a little far there, but as long as it's within the 1/4 of an inch, which it is, we now have a cup ready to go. So what we have now is, this is a cup with the lining on the inside, or if you haven't put the lining on the inside, you'll be able to see the boning and the foam on the inside of the cup. And we are now ready to attach our cups to our band. Okay, so we now have our band partially done. We have both cups fully done. So at the moment I have one lined and one unlined. We're going to work with the unlined one just because it's easier to see what we're doing. So I'll put this one aside for the moment. And we're going to attach our cup to our band. So basically we want to make sure that we've got the correct cup, because it is so easy to try and put them in the wrong way around, but you've got a much smaller section that goes on the inner side. So make sure you've got the small section on the inside and the larger triangular section on the outside. And then we're just going to go and put it right sides together. We're going to start at center front. Now, once again, what I find is if you've got this boning in here, it's best to try and push it as far to the other end as you can. And then we want to make sure that at that 1/4 of an inch seam line, our the end of our cup and the end of our bridge line up. And then I like to roll it around. Do exactly the same at the outer side. Make sure that they're all neatly aligned. And then I'm just going to work my way back around, making sure that the raw edges are all aligned and that it sits neatly. Obviously, don't try pinning through the boning, doesn't work. I think I've just about got that pinned in place. It all lined up really neatly and we're ready to sew. So we're going to sew at 1/4 inch. So we need to make sure that, well, we want to make sure that that line is inside. However, if it does wander out, we can always unpick it later. But yep, we're just going to sew at 1/4 inch all the way around. Make sure the boning pieces are pushed up as far as they can go so that they're not in the way. And that this one is out of the way. You'll want to move it as you sew, so make sure it's out of the way here, and then when you get around to this side, we'll push it back so it's out of the way on this side, and we're ready to sew. Okay, we have our cup in. We want to double check that there's no tucks or anything from the right hand side. It all looks good. Do a quick inspection. What we want to do now is add our underwire channeling. So the underwire channeling is going to sit on the cup side and it's going to be pressed towards the band. We're going to want, now we do have tables of channeling length in the instructions, and if you cut it to the length, it will sit just at the junction of the band and the cup. However, I do tend to like to just add a little bit of extra so that it's much easier to get the underwire in later. So we want to have the edge of the channeling lined up with our stitching line that we just did, and then we're going to sew just inside, like 1/16 of an inch inside that existing stitching line. So I'm actually not going to pin this, I'm just going to stitch it as I go. Now you want to make sure that the band is out from underneath. Okay, we now have our underwire channeling affixed to our cup. At the moment, I'm just going to trim this once again so you've got a little bit of the channeling sticking up beyond the seam. We'll finish all of those later. Now, before we can sew down our underwire channeling, as you can see here, the underwire channeling is actually going to sit right on top of this piece of boning. So what we need to do is we actually need to put this piece of boning in right now. Trimming our corners off. Smoothing them out. Boning into the channel, and we need to cut it down to size. So it needs about 1/2 inch off the bottom. Ooh. Trim the corners. Okay, and whilst we're waiting for that to dry, I'm actually also going to go through and just trim some of the bulk out of some of these seams so that we don't have anything sticking out beyond the channeling. A bit of the elastic there can go. Okay. Okay, and now that we've got our boning in place, now this is where you need to make a decision on what your machine can handle. This plastic boning can be sewed through if your machine can handle it. I generally try and change to a larger size needle if I am going to sew through it. If you aren't going to sew through it, then for the time being, just have a good feel for where it ends and mark that spot. And we're only going to sew from that spot at this point, and then we'll come back later and you will have to hand finish this. But I'm going to just see how my machine goes, and we'll try and stitch through the boning, and we'll see how that goes. So I'll take that pin out. Now, on this side, you want to make sure that your underwire channeling sits right next to your boning channeling. Again, you don't want to sew on the channeling here. And we can choose either to sew from this side, or if you are worried about what it's going to look like from the outside, you can choose to sew from the right side and just make sure you know exactly where the edge of that underwire channeling is. So I'm actually just going to sew it from the inside, mainly because I want to be able to see. I want to check that we're not sewing over the channeling here and on this side, and I just find it much easier. So I will start with my needle down because we're right here at the boning. So we're just going to sew nice and slowly. Let's see, I might need there we go. Now we're started. Okay, now as I'm going along, I'm making sure that the main fabric is pulled out so we're not getting any tucks. Okay, we have our underwire channeling in place. Let's check it from the front side. There's no little tucks or anything. No, it's looking pretty good. Okay, well then I'm happy with that. We can go ahead and do the exact same with our second cup and our second piece of underwire channeling. Okay, we now have our cups inserted into our band. We have our underwire channeling all stitched down, and we do actually have our first piece of boning already in the center. Now we're going to put the boning in the rest of our band. Now, the first thing we want to look at is the curvature of our boning. Now, we don't want these sharp ends poking into our bodies. We want them sort of facing out. So I'm going to put the boning in that direction. But first we need to finish this top edge. And we will start here at the outer edge, just waiting for it to cool. Yep. Find that gap between the layers of the channeling. Now make sure the boning goes right up past the elastic to the top. And once again, we're going to measure. I'm just going to mark it with my fingernail there, pull it back out and cut it 1/2 inch shorter. Once again, finish the edges. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and do that for all of our pieces of channeling. Okay, I've got all of my boning into all of the different channels now. We need to finish off the lower edge of the channels. Now there's a couple of different things that we can do here, and I'm just going to talk through the options. Now, we can, like we did on the bottom of the bra, sew a little line right next to the bottom of the boning. However, you will be able to see that line from the right side. So it's up to you whether you want to see that line or not. Or, because we are now folding this up, that boning can't move anywhere. So you can leave it without. And then when we go to stitch this elastic down, we have the choice of, again, like we did up here, stopping and starting at each channeling section, or if you've got the needle and your machine can deal with it, just sew right over all of them. Now, personally, what I do is, because I have a tendency to get lots of little threads and things, I don't like having all the extra stitching on the outside. So I do just sew over the top of the boning, and that means the boning can't move in the channeling anymore, so I don't need that extra line of stitching down the bottom. So that's what we're going to do today. But if your machine doesn't like sewing through the plastic boning, you can just do a little line of stitching right here. I've actually done one here already, just to show you. And then you can just stop and start at each set of channels. Okay, we're going to take it to the machine now and finish off this lower band. Oh, the one other thing I will talk about. When we get to this lower section of the cup, as you can see, the elastic does go over the channeling for the underwire. Generally, when you were making a bra, you would do this seam first and then put the channeling over the top, but we couldn't do that and still get the boning in. So you just need to be aware that we don't want to sew over this channeling, or you won't be able to get your underwire in. So instead of sewing along that top edge, I tend to just bring that seam in, so it's sewing just along the edge of the underwire channeling at that point, just for that little section, and then I go back to the outer edge. Okay, we are going to sew the lower elastic now. Because we're sewing through an elastic and we want it to have stretch, we'll use a zigzag stitch. So set your machine to a zigzag stitch with 3.5 wide, 3 long. All these are in the instructions. And again, I'm going to sew this from the wrong side so I can see exactly what I'm doing. And I am going to try and sew over all the boning. We'll just see how the machine handles it. Maybe not. Okay, so now we're getting to this underwire channeling part. I want to make sure that I'm not sewing through the underwire channeling, so I'm just going to dip down. And again for the second cut. Okay, so we have now sewn our lower elastic down. I'm going to check it from the right hand side and make sure it looks good. Yep, we haven't gone onto the channeling there, so that's good, I can see that. So we are ready for just about the final stages. We're going to add our hooks and eyes to the edge, our underwire, and we're done. Okay, so we're going to add our hook and eye. As you can see, I just have one big long continuous tape here, and it will tell you in the instructions how many hooks and eyes. However, I tend to, I have found that when you're using this continuous tape, if you don't cut it exactly, you can have issues with the hook and the eye not aligning perfectly. So what I'm going to do is just get a rough idea of how many hooks and eyes I'm going to need. Cut one extra. So this is what I also said, to buy 1 or 2 extras. And then take our hook and eye and actually hook them together. So as you can see here, just from that, we're not matching perfectly. So I'll now be able to trim it down so it does match. Now, the next thing we want to remember is which way our hook and eyes goes. This one throws me every single time. So we have the hooks on your right-hand side as worn, facing down. So we'll just start on this side. So all I'm going to do is use a chalk marker. I will not use pen. Oh no, for the purpose, you will want to use a chalk marker, but for the purposes of the sew along, I'm just going to use a Sharpie here, and I'm just going to mark exactly where on my hook and eye tape I want to cut. Now, I'm going to take this to the other end, and with a trusty ruler, just mark my hook and eye tape in the same place and just double check that it's going to work nicely there. So, yep, that's going to fit nicely. Okay, and now I can trim my hook and eye tape all in one go so that it matches evenly. Okay, now we can go ahead and attach our hook and eye. I'll undo those, and I'm just going to pin them on the correct side so I remember which one goes where. We've got the hook facing down on the right hand side, and the eyes on the left hand side facing up. Okay, I do tend to prefer sewing the eyes on first. It's just a little bit easier. So we're going to open up our hook and eye and make sure we've got our fabric caught in between. And yeah, on the other end, make sure it's all even. And now I'm just going to baste this in place before we go any further. So we are going to just baste these in place to start with so that we can remove our pins. A long stitch length, and what I find works much better is if I move the needle to the right so that I can get my my foot there. You can also use your zipper foot so that you can get a stitch closer to the hooks, but I'm just going to move my needle over to the right, and we're just going to baste in place with a longer stitch length. Double checking that that worked on the correct other side. Yep. So let's baste our eyes in place. So here we're not limited by our hooks, but I'm just trying to baste again about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the hook and eye tape. And we just want to double check that when we do the hook and eye up, the edges are nicely aligned. Okay, so our next step is to actually go back and sew this with a zigzag stitch. And then because this is continuous and we've had to cut these edges, I'm actually going to start all the way up here. I'm going to sew down along one edge, along that bottom edge of the hook and eye tape and then all the way back up the other edge. And we're going to need a zigzag stitch for this. We want it to be 3.5 wide by about 0.5 long, so a really dense stitch. And then we will start sewing. I'm actually going to start from this lower edge. Now, when we're doing the zigzag stitch, we basically want the right-hand side of the zigzag to fall basically right on the edge of the fabric here. So at this corner, I'm going to take the, leave the needle down and just pivot right off the edge of the fabric there. And then we can continue it along this edge of the hook and eye. You may need to do some finagling of the cups to get them through the machine. And again, we need to go right to the very end, and then we can pivot, and then back along. So that is actually not quite as dense a zigzag as I was hoping for. So I would possibly go over that, making my stitch just a little bit shorter as well. Let's try on the other side, making our stitch a little bit shorter. Okay, that is a much better zigzag stitch. Now, once again, I'm sewing this with a contrasting thread. If you're sewing this with a matching thread, this will look much neater and nicer. Okay, we have now got our hook and eye attached, and we're ready to insert our underwires. Now, we're using the vertical underwires, and they you can usually tell the front from the side really easily because the side comes up quite a bit higher. You'll also find that the center section is more colored, whilst the outside is always gray. So look for the colorful one, and that goes in the center. So we're going to insert our underwire into our channeling. Because both ends of the channel are free, you can insert it from either end. You want to see if you can make sure you're not going behind the channeling. You actually want to get it inside the channeling. Get that right down into it. And then our second piece, I need to flip that around. And again, see if I can find the channeling so you're not going behind it. And we've got that in. Okay, so now we just need to finish off the ends of these channeling. So all we're going to do is from the right-hand side, we're going to sew a little bar tack right across the end of the channeling here. So you're going to want to push the underwire out of the way. You do not want to hit the underwire with your needle. We'll sew a little bar tack on the outside. We'll sew one long bar tack all the way across the center of the bridge. So that finishes not only both ends of the channeling, but also the boning underneath, the boning channeling underneath. And the outside on this side as well. So we're just going to add those 3 bar tacks. Okay, so we're now going to do our little bar tacks. Some machines have a bar tack function. If not, you're just using a small dense zigzag stitch, the same one that you use to attach your hook and eye. So that's 3.5 wide by 1/2 long. And we're just going to sew close to the top edge, but not right off the edge like we were doing last time. Okay, I have attempted to sew bar tacks at each outside edge and along the center. Our machine had a few conniptions, so but But what we now need to do is trim our underwire nice and close to the stitching. So we're just going to trim it as close as we can down near the stitching. And we're going to do that for all 3 sections again. So from the right hand side, you should not be able to see any of the underwire channeling anymore. So we are basically done. Unless you want, the only thing we have left to do is to sew a little optional bow right in the center that will cover this bar tack. If you don't want the bow, then you're done. If you do, we will have to sew that on by hand. So all we need to do is take a hand needle and thread. I've threaded some, obviously not matching thread through my needle and tied a knot in the end. It's doubled over, and we're just going to position our little bow right here in between the 2 cups. So we want to hide the knot underneath, so I'm just going to try and take a small stitch through the front of my fabric. I don't want to be trying to sew through all layers. I am just going to sew through the front of my fabric. I'll position my bow in position, and I'm basically just going to sew the bow on around this center section where the thread's going to be hidden underneath the little pearl here. So I just take a stitch underneath, come up through the bottom of the bow. Ooh, so hard. Now, make sure my bow. And then each time I'm just going to go around this center section. Oh, no, I'm going to have to turn it around to the other side here. So we're basically just adding threads around the very center portion of the bow. And then occasionally going right through the bow as well, just to hold it in place. And there we go. We have our bow on and our bra is complete. Okay, that's it. We have completed our Symmes Strapless Bra. Okay, if you want any more help, if you want to learn any more about Cashmerette bras, go to our link below.